If honesty were suddenly introduced into American life, the whole system would collapse. George Carlin.
If this really becomes a tech Cold War, like it's looking like it will be, to technologies that are more favorable to U.S. and its allies' stewardship of the next-gen global financial system. Otherwise, we face a potential catastrophe. I don't know what the odds are, but there's some meaningful, probability if China was to get control over the next-gen financial system. I mean, that could really be devastating to American power and its allies' ability to make payments to defense payments to an ally. American banks that might be blocked or throttled back on how fast their payments go. You could even see some terrible situation where a U.S. company that has a low Chinese social credit score could be blocked from that new infrastructure. Those are bad outcomes. Even if there's a small percentage chance that happens, we've got to check that to make sure that we're involved and we're competitive as a country.
The global economy is undergoing a fundamental shift. China and the U.S. are in a Cold War to compete for the high ground in the next-gen financial system.
Is when we talk about the correspondent banking relationships. And that is, there is the number of Chinese CBRs, correspondent banking relationships, has increased globally from 65 in 2009 to 2,246 in 2016. Now that's already 5 years old. So, you can imagine that that's probably well increased. And I think that just shows the need. I mean, obviously, if China is opening more of these relationships with banks and countries around the world, there's more countries around the world that are going to wanting to be developing. And I think when you're a tiny nation in the Caribbean, for example, I know Barbados has been having a very strong relationship with China. Their prime minister has reached out and has really developed a great relationship, from trade to vaccines, here with COVID, and all relationships. And I think this is what we're going to see moving forward, especially from these smaller nations. You don't want to just depend on the United States. I think ideally you'd want to have a good relationship with both US and China.
Chinese correspondent banking grows by 3,355% since 2009. Has been in terminal decline in trade finance since the time of the financial crisis. U.S. and European banks have largely given up. Nearly 46% of the banks surveyed terminated correspondent relationships due to the cost of complexity of compliance, while 70% of the respondents reported declining transactions due to AML and KYC requirements. Chinese, on the other hand, do not face the same regulatory pressures to carry out Know Your Customer checks, nor do they live in fear of heavily financial penalties imposed by U.S. regulators. Correspondent banking is a network of banking. If you have to transfer money from Hong Kong to Buenos Aires, for example, there are probably a few correspondent banks involved in that transaction. But in the future, it will be point to point. There'll be no intermediaries, and that's where this technology will come into play. Blockchain will help us come up with this new way, so to speak. We'll avoid using SWIFT. Ultimately, it's SWIFT we're talking about here, and this is a way of bypassing the SWIFT network. It comes down to the fact there will be a need to transfer money across regions, but the traditional correspondent banking network will not be the one being used.
Okay. What really, if you think about it, we have the RMB already. It exists. So people know about RMB. What we're doing is we're creating a new RMB that has a brand new digital transfer mechanism underneath it.
Interesting.
So the digital RMB can become very successful in international trade, but without ever impacting central bank holdings. So let me explain. Because the route and path of digital RMB transmission is independent of SWIFT, independent of the traditional, and I have to say this, Western-dominated banking network,
Right.
It simply doesn't show up. So what happens, let's imagine we're 10 years in the future, and in my book, I talk about where you have to really be thinking long-term about this.
Yeah.
If 10 years from now, Belt and Road countries start to become big users of digital RMB for purchasing physical items, trade, containers full of refrigerators from China, right? Mm-hmm. That will all be contained on this different network. And guess what? You won't see it in central bank holdings. So you could actually have a very large success with a large flow of money on these digital network, and the reserve currency status for RMB would be unchanged. But all of a sudden you'd say, hey, entire countries have revalued their trade from dollar to RMB, but their central bank holdings are still at 2%.
Right.
So here's what I challenge, or I want to give our listeners a challenge.
Okay.
You will read many, many articles about the digital RMB, and they will ask this exact question: can the RMB, the digital RMB, help displace the dollar?
Correct.
And in the end, you will always hear the following: digital RMB holdings are only 2% of global reserves, so it is highly unlikely. And that's the wrong question, because you could revalue trade and have digital RMB holdings be completely unaffected.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to watch as this plays out over a longer time horizon. The digital RMB will not, nor was it designed by the PBOC, and no one from the PBOC has ever said the digital RMB is designed to eliminate or dollar use.
Right.
However, they have been clear. It is designed to reduce China's dependence on the dollar.
Nice. Okay, that makes sense.
So what you're looking at is a means of conducting trade that is not a dollar, that is conducted on its own, what we call payment rails, this new digital payment system. And it allows China to be independent from Western banks. It allows them to conduct business, particularly with BRI and developing countries, who can now conduct business directly with China in digital RMB. It'll be cheap, it'll be efficient. It'll be a game changer for trade for many parts of the world with China. So it's going to be very significant.
Yeah.
Even if it's not designed specifically to replace the dollar,
Right.
it will displace a significant percentage of dollar trade.
Central bank digital currency systems are not a direct threat to the reserve currency, but the fundamental design eliminates the need for a reserve currency. 80% of countries are working on CBDCs.
Back in the early days of my career, it was always, well, Social Security is going to go bust, but it's going to be 2060. And then it was 2050, and that was 2040, and that was 2030, and now I think it's before 2030. And in lockstep with that, it was China is going to be a larger economy in the United States by 2060, same thing, pulled forward. And now I kind of think from a true productive economy sense, I think China's economy is bigger than the United States already. It isn't from a GDP calculation because of the way it's calculated. But when it comes to actual productive capacity, I think it's higher. And of course, the Chinese GDP, even by the classical measure, has grown quite a lot relative to the United States and is now getting in the ballpark. And of course, they have much better fiscal situation, shadow banking problems pushed aside. I'm just talking about the savings rate and things like that. So what happens when China continues to build its military, which they clearly have intentions of doing? Their economy gets bigger than the United States economy. Their military gets bigger than the US military. They've got these hypersonic weapons that are far ahead of ours, at least as far as I know. I mean, maybe we have them, but they're not telling us. Mm-hmm. But China apparently is doing well there, and Russia as well. So what happens when you have the largest military and the largest economy? I kind of think you deserve a seat at the table of reserve currency. And that, I think, has been a goal of China for a long time. Mm-hmm. So I almost feel like there's no turning back on some of these things. I feel like the Taiwan Chinese situation is getting near an end game. I think the U.S. dollar reserve currency situation is getting more near an end game. And that's really going to be the game changer. When I say the next bailout is going to be the one that maybe breaks the camel's back, I think it'll take the dollar down. Mm-hmm. So it's in the next recession, I think, that we're going to see dollar weakness. And the dollar is very, very overvalued versus our twin deficits. One of my most trusted indicators is the direction of the dollar broadly versus the twin deficits as a percentage of GDP. There's a long lead time. It's a long-term thing. It doesn't work for a year. It's something that has like an 8-year cycle.
The dollar is stressed from debt to GDP. Now enters a tech that eliminates the need for reserves for trade. Those reserves are demand. So if we eliminate the demand, that supply gets released onto the market, making the dollar weaker. The second largest economy in the world is pushing for a tech that does this globally.
As we're looking at this Caribbean area, the United States has dominated the banking, area there. I mean, they've been very influential there. But what we've seen recently is the United States is actually pulling out of that area. And I think this is a big trend. And a big thing is really de-risking. Can you tell us a little bit about, what is de-risking and why is the United States banks pulling out of the Caribbean region?
Sure. And that's a great question. So the Caribbean is really a microcosm for the fundamental question of why will other countries use the digital RMB, or why will countries even use the normal RMB for trade? It's really common for people in the US to think, well, US banks are big, they're all over the place. And that's true to a degree. So we can look at the Caribbean. Look at the Caribbean as a microcosm. Each one of these little islands is a country. They have their own governments. And what has happened since 9/11, something that's called de-risking. Banks don't like risk. So when they remove risk, they, quote, de-risk.
Correct.
And the risk that they're trying to eliminate is the risk that they do business with money launderers or bad people.
Correct.
All right. So drug running, money laundering, illegal cash transfers of some form or another. So what many of the US banks have done is to simply close their operations in the Caribbean.
Right.
So what you find now is that the Caribbean has Canadian banks, but frankly, in most Caribbean countries, there are no longer representatives of US banks there, which presents a problem. Because here's the funny thing. The Caribbean, if you look at their trade statistics, buy most of their goods from the United States. It's sort of funny because what they're really doing is they're importing Chinese-made goods through the United States. They come through Long Beach, California port, and they take whatever route and they get to the Caribbean. When the US banks close, it makes doing business in US dollars with the United States more expensive. You ask the fundamental question, and this is a good one. And people say, well, why? Why would I use the digital yuan? Why would I use the digital RMB, however you want to call it?
Right.
Why would we use this to conduct trade with China when we have dollars? And the answer is, for many developing nations, go to Africa, go to South America, go to the Caribbean, for many small countries, because of bank de-risking, dollars are not easy to get, and there is a cost associated with doing dollar-based business that the digital RMB will likely decrease. So if it's cheaper to do business with China using a digital RMB, you'll do it. You'll take, most people will just go for the cheapest way to do anything. So the Caribbean is really an interesting, I call it a microcosm of the bigger question, who's going to use the RMB, the digital RMB, and why?
The Caribbean islands are buying Chinese goods from America using a correspondent banking relationships that are being taxed twice. The Caribbean islands are buying Chinese goods from America using correspondent banking and paying a middleman fee to the U.S. They're being taxed twice. Why not use China's CBDC directly with China? The Great Reset is a shift by political leaders and corporate behemoths that have agreed on where the world should be directed. This involves a technological convergence in green energy. Today we use fossil fuels and all oil is priced in dollars. The goal of green energy will drastically reduce dependence on oil and increase the need for alternative energy sources like cobalt and lithium. Developing nations like Chile are rich in lithium, and the Congo is rich in cobalt. The US and China are economic powerhouses that will need to buy cobalt and lithium to produce green energy goods. If the US banks cut ties with Chile and the Congo, the US can no longer trade with them, while China is offering a direct, instant line to developing nations.
Oh, look, absolutely. And, if the U.S. has been remiss in anything in the past, 15, 20 years, it's been that a lot of these developing nations have been somewhat forgotten about.
Yeah.
And, that's so, the U.S. now wants to work with the G7 and put together what's called Build Back Better program on a global scale. I think that's
Correct.
wonderful.
Right.
No problem. I think it's great. But the reality is, for many years, many of these nations have been not just forgotten about, but actually cut off from the U.S. financial system. If you're not actively building infrastructure there, and then you cut off the banking ties, it's very, where and what can these nations do? That's why something like the digital RMB is so potentially powerful for them, because it gives them a way to potentially use a digital currency that allows them to pay for whatever imports they want to import from China within minutes.
Correct. Yeah.
It's not a matter of days. Wait for the check to clear. No, it's bang. It's going to hit you. You convert to digital RMB. You buy with digital RMB. It clears customs electronically.
Ripple is a U.S. company with some very powerful people on board. China's digital RMB might bypass KYC and AML requirements, but Ripple does not. Now think about this. We're in a tech Cold War with China. China is advancing while the U.S. seems stagnant, but one of the U.S. private sector leaders has made incredible strides in digital currency technology, as well as liquidity in these developing countries and emerging markets.
The U.S. and the West has basically had a system in place. If you don't do what we want, Iran or North Korea, you won't have access to the international banking system. People won't bank with you. Well, that is becoming less and less powerful, partly through the digital yuan and partly through other innovations where people are just going around SWIFT because it's slow and inaccurate in all those ways that Monica and Christina are about to talk about in bringing payments out of the digital era. But this is a really key point because Ripple is really at the cutting edge of this. So you guys should all be really proud to work here. 75% of big global banks, especially US ones, are pulling out of the international correspondent banking system. It's just too onerous. The regulatory requirements are too painful, and people say, well, it's not worth it. Why should I have a correspondent banking pair with Uganda or Ghana or, Chile? Why should I bother? And so new innovations like the Chinese digital yuan, like the big payments platforms in China, could take its place. On the US side, what do we have? I mean, if we had national champions in the US, which we don't, of course, Ripple would be it. We could be on the really positive side of this as we start gaining traction. And I don't have to tell you all because you work here and you help make this happen every single day, but we're designed as capable of disrupting illicit transactions. We do full AML, KYC. We can counter corruption in developing countries because instead of sending cash, people are sending assets digitally. We're helping with financial inclusion, all of that while safeguarding privacy. And what's stopping us? In the US, I think through no malicious intent, but if you look at the maze of people who regulate people like us, fintech companies, banks, et cetera, cryptocurrencies, it's very unclear. There's an alphabet soup of US regulators working with this, none of them coordinating very well, and most of them not very well versed in these new technologies or understanding of this global reality that Sandy and I just laid out.
If we had national champions, it would be Ripple. If you haven't seen my video on Palau, please go back and watch it. It suggests that the U.S. is joined at the hip with Palau. Now, Palau is issuing a U.S. dollar on the XRP ledger. That means that there is some type of awareness to what is going on, and the U.S. had to sign off on it in some capacity. Anya also mentions that Ripple carries out all KYC and AML requirements.
Absolutely. Now, let me add another dimension to this, which is, again, I'm just starting to see it covered. It's a critical part of my book.
Okay.
I'm just starting to see it in the news, finally. And that is the digital RMB is not just a currency. Many analysts think about it as, well, it's money. It's no different than any other money. And that's wrong. The digital RMB is an entry ticket or an entry token into something new. And the new thing, it is China's digital logistics network. So China, using 5G, using blockchain, using many new technologies, is designing a system, and it's already in place in China. It's now expanding, which will allow you to purchase something digitally, and it will you can buy your container full of refrigerators.
Mm-hmm.
You can document it to customs. You can clear customs. You can get on the container on board the ship. Everything will happen as part of a massive blockchain digital logistics system. So when you are in a BRI country and you push the button to say buy with digital RMB, you'll get a delivery date at your doorstep and you're done. The tricky part is that many in the finance community, and I spent most of my career, 18 years in finance, are simply looking at digital RMB as another form of money.
Right.
And what they're not seeing is that it comes with something very important attached, and that is this digital logistics system, which is already being built, and it's digital trade finance, and it's digital shipping, and it's monitoring where your package is, your container is, from whether it's left the factory to where it is on the road to whether it's on the ship, where in the ship it is. It's really quite remarkable.
It's the whole ecosystem, right? It's not just a new currency. It's the whole system that goes with that currency that's being developed, right? So that's the big difference.
And that's what people are missing.
Right.
It is, and that's really important. And anybody who lives in China today, we get on WeChat, we get on Alipay, we get on JD, or we get on Alibaba, we buy something. I can see where it is. There's a little map. It shows me where it is. I know exactly when that thing is coming to my doorstep.
Right.
You know, it's really, and you have to, and okay, you say, well, that's easy. It's domestic. That's true. But
Right.
that entire concept, the way of thinking, is being ramped up on a global scale. And it's all related to blockchain, which we have in China, what's called the Blockchain Service Network. It's really a transformation into this smart logistics, intelligent logistics, which the rest of the world hasn't made yet.
Digital currencies, crypto asset networks are one piece of converging technologies. We have seen TradeLens that uses Interledger Protocol, or the platforms R3 is built for trade. These platforms are built by Western companies, and this is how the U.S. innovates. The U.S. allows the private sector to build, and the best platforms are the winners, while China is a top-down approach where China's government hires and directs the private sector to build what they're looking for. Public and private distributed ledgers interconnected, transferring value and confidential information out in the open where anyone can access it but only the users can participate. Artificial intelligence analyzing ledgers, as well as a convergence of cloud computing, 5G, Internet of Things, allowing smart platforms to efficiently move value and eliminating friction and cost. Everything of value on the legacy system has a tremendous amount of friction that will be wiped out. Smart trade platforms will boost global GDP, meaning the world becomes richer. Innovation will lead the globe to a new age of prosperity. Understand what you're investing in. Value out in the open allows this paradigm shift to take place. Public chains or cryptos are the protocols where value can be hosted on the web freely.
Yeah, I think we all know that the central banking system like we currently have is not a good one. The Federal Reserve in the United States, for example, privately owned, based on debt, it's not going to be forever. It's not going to last. It's got to change, and I think blockchain has that whole perspective, that ability to create amazing changes. I think, we also have to be very careful that, for example, we know that Bitcoin uses tremendous amounts of electricity. It uses tremendous amounts of memory to make it happen. So the idea that it's environmentally better, we have to be careful how we look at that. And but it's at its infancy. Bitcoin is there. It's had a huge impact. I think we could call it a form of gambling in a way. I'm not sure that that's the right way to go at all, but it has shown us that there's a new opportunity here. And definitely we need to revise our whole issue around currency. The dollar, for example, is just too powerful in the world. Empires have always imposed their currency, whether it was the Persian Empire or the Chinese Empire or the Ottoman Empire or whatever the empire. And recently it's been the American Empire and the dollar. That's bound to change. And we don't really want to move to another hard currency like the Chinese currency or some other. I think the idea of using blockchain to take us into a new era is an important one, but we've got to be very, very careful about the environmental issues and the other issues around.
The central planners, the political leaders, the corporate behemoths around the globe have determined the direction we are headed towards. This shift is happening, and public, trustless, jurisdictionless crypto networks have a strong use case in this new world. Governments don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. That is against their interest. They want obedient workers, people who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork, and just dumb enough to passively accept it. George Carlin. Thanks everyone, I hope you enjoyed the show. Please remember to like, subscribe, and comment. If you enjoy my work and wish to support my channel, please consider joining my Patreon.